Second slide, please. It's a quote from Kurt Vonnegut. "We are what we pretend to be, so we must be careful about what we pretend to be." Next slide. This is what I pretend to be. Okay, next one, please.
Sorry.
No. Okay. No,
Yep.
back. Got it. Okay.
Right.
These are all the things I pretend to be. Jewish, I'm an ex-single parent, I'm a stepdad. I'm a gardener, I'm nowhere as good as my dad. I'm a cook, nowhere as good as my son. I'm a musician, nowhere as good as Harry Procter. And I'm a novelist, nowhere as good as virtually any novelist you can name. I'm a father of 5. I was an Alisand for a number of years. I'm disabled, so I receive services. I'm known as a consulting critical clinical psychologist, which basically means, in my brother's words, it's all a load of fucking bollocks. That's his honest opinion of psychology. I'm a compassionate conversationalist, if you pay me enough. I'm ex-chair of the BPS psychotherapy section. I'm a director of NHS psychotherapy department. I'm a researcher, I'm an author, I'm an editor, all of those things. And I now run a publishing company called Egalitarian Publishing. And
what aren't you, Craig?
Number of things. Okay, next slide. Next slide. So, who's us lot? It's all very well talking about Judaism, but you can't talk about Judaism, a bit like I talked about Christianity. There's not just one form of Judaism. There are numerous forms of Judaism. My family's Reform, so there's Reform, Conservative, Reconstructionist, Orthodox, Orthodox including Haredi, Orthodox including Hasidim, Centrist Orthodox, and Modern Orthodox. Others call themselves non-denominational, trans-denominational, post-denomination, denominational, humanistic, and my favorite, Jews for Jesus, which is an American organization. Okay, next. Next slide, thank you. Okay, I'm going to give you some sort of background to where Judaism sits in terms of what might be described as the essence of modern psychology and psi. The first Lubavitcher Rebbe, Shneor Zalman, believed that the animal soul, which has to do with physical pleasures, and the godly soul, which has to do with transcendent experience, were at war with each other. Next slide. This is Kant. The mind's operations are considered to be of 3 kinds: knowing, willing, and feeling. Now, one of the things that's important about that is, apart from the fact it's Kant, is the whole idea of tripartite systems. Well, not we as a general, but people, particularly professionals, can be good at splitting things into 3s, 6s. Often people might say things like, there are 2 kinds of people. And there are indeed 2 kinds of people. There are people who say things like 2 kinds of people, and there are the rest. So a tripartite system, these systems cover all sorts of things. So for example, id, ego, and superego, Burns' adult, parent, child, and Beck's cognitive behavior therapy, thought, behavior, and emotion. Next one. Next slide, that's it.
Yeah.
Heinrichs Leben des Strengen des Seelenlebens, which a fantastic historian called Richards, he translated that as Textbook of Disorders of the Soul. Came out in 1818. His system stresses madness having its source in sin. And again, it seems to predict Freud's tripartite division of the mind, the id, the ego, the id, the ego, and superego. But This was anticipated via hedonistic, instinctual, central ego, and conscience levels. So this was already around long before Freud came up with his system. And of course, Freud's system, he didn't use those Latin words. They were used by his English translator. The system uses an orthodox religious framework wherein submission to the demands of conscience lead to the sole path to God. Next slide. Psychological and psychoanalytic theories reflect the origins of their creators. In Jewish tradition, the impulse to be good, the Yetzer Hatov, is balanced out by the Yetzer Hara, an inclination to destructiveness, a position that can be likened to Freud's notion of the life and death instincts. I'm going to come on to why Freud might have been so influenced by these ideas. Next slide, please. This is the traditional role of the rabbi or the rebbe. The gabbai, the rebbe's assistant, met with people before they met with the rebbe, and then, after interviewing the supplicant about his family, his background, and his troubles, the gabbai delivers a kvittel, a written description of the presenting problem, and an oral report to the rebbe. Now, some people might regard that as the kind of work that in this country, at least, psychological assistants do when they interview new patients and new clients, and then they give a report to the psychologist. Next slide. Okay, here are some of the founders of psychoanalysis. Freud, Ferenczi, Abraham, Eitingon, and Sachs, all Jewish, of course, were all present at the first meeting of the International Psychoanalytical Congress. Jung was there as well, but he denounced Freudian psychoanalysis as a Jewish science unsuited to the Aryan soul. And one of the claims that Jeffrey Masson makes, which I think, well, I'm pretty sure it's right, is that Jung changed some of his theories in order to be enabled to carry on working in Nazi Germany. Now, if I was working in Nazi Germany, there's a good chance I'd have changed a few of my theories had I survived, which would have been, I would have been unlikely to have survived in Nazi Germany. But Jung did indeed change a number of his theories, and he rejected Freudian analysis because it was indeed unsuited to the Aryan soul, whatever that is. Next slide. Here are some of the theorists. These are the psychotherapy theorists. As you can see, there's a few, and this list was off the top of my head. So Freud, Melanie Klein, Anna Freud, Fritz Perls, Byrne, Beck, Adler, Bettelheim, Reich, Breuer, Rank, Erickson, and there are many more. Next. Viktor Frankl, inventor of logotherapy, and some of you may well know this, but Viktor Frankl made all sorts of claims in Man's Search of Meaning, which was basically about him being incarcerated. He was taken to a camp, he claimed. It turned out that although I think his sister and certainly his mother were killed in the camps, he only spent about a week in a railway siding, and all of his work that became Man's Search for Meaning, although there's still truth in what he says, he didn't say it from a position of being in a camp. Dear old Albert Ellis, rational emotive therapy. Richard Bandler, neurolinguistic programming. Arthur Yanov, primal therapy. Francine Shapiro, inventor of EMDR. Next slide. Joseph Jastrow, his dad, authored a Talmud dictionary. He was the first recipient of an American PhD in psychology in 1898 and went on to establish a psychological laboratory at the University of Wisconsin.
Do you know who his supervisor was, Craig?
It wasn't you.
It was Charles S. Peirce, founder of
was it?
pragmatism and they wrote a paper together on the just noticeable difference.
Yeah.
It's actually still a very, very valid concept now.
Okay, thank you. Next one. Here are some of the psychologists, again off the top of my head. Ash, Festinger, Kohlberg, Lewin, Maslow, Seligman, Els Frenkel Brunswick, Eric Fromm, and David Veschler. Next one. Within British clinical psychology, the major founders of British clinical psychology, amongst them were Joseph Wolpe, who was a South African psychiatrist, Monty Shapiro, who was the first recipient of the BPS's award named in his honor in 1984. Next. Daryl Rachman was Jewish, and he was quoted in Wolpe. I use this just to entertain people a bit. Rachman utilized both photographs and imagination in the treatment of a man who was sexually aroused by women's buttocks and bloomers. Aversive conditioning sessions incorporated photographs of women in bloomers and imagined scenes of bloomers and of women with attractive buttocks. Electric shocks were applied to the fingers 10 to 15 times for each stimulus at each session. The patient said he no longer felt attracted by buttocks and disposed of his collection of pornographic photographs. Well, wouldn't you? Next slide. David Rosenhan, for those of you who don't know, I'm sure you do know Rosenhan. David Rosenhan did the famous experiment where a group of people pretended to be mad and were then admitted to a psychiatric hospital and then acted completely normally, and all of their behavior was recorded as signs of schizophrenia and other psychoses. The follow-up story to that is a while later, Rosenhan said he was going to repeat the experiment. And within about a week of him saying that, any number of people were actually discharged from the psychiatric hospital, but Rosenhan hadn't repeated the experiment. George Weinberg, who was the inventor of the term homophobia, Bob J. Lifton, Irvin Staub, they've both written a lot about psy professionals, both psychologists and psychiatrists, their involvement in genocide. And Joe Burke, who co-founded the Arbors Association. And Burke also has written, for those of you who haven't seen it, an absolutely brilliant account of Freud. It came out about 3 years ago. And I quoted from his book earlier on. It's a fantastic book. Okay.
What was the title of that, Craig?
You'd have to go, oh, hang on, I can tell you, I can go on my other screen. No. See it somewhere.
Don't worry now.
Oh, there it is. There it is. It's called The Hidden Freud.
Right.
His Hasidic Roots. Came out in 2015. It's absolutely brilliant. Freud himself, of course, was he was a descendant of a long series of rabbis. Next slide. Jay Katz, another good Jewish boy. He was professor of psychiatry at Yale. And he made this point because the way psychiatric labels are invented is they're voted into the Diagnostic and Statistic Manual by a committee. And when DSM-3 came out, Katz pointed out that the reason every behavior was now classifiable as a mental disorder, it meant that psychiatrists and psychologists could claim money from insurance companies based on quite ordinary behavior. And that's still the case, of course. Next slide. Okay, I'm moving on to a slightly different element of critique. Even when all possible scientific questions have been answered, the problems of life, i.e., how should I live my life, remain completely untouched. Next slide. That quote from Wittgenstein is rather unfortunate for the British Psychological Society, because in their first editorial of the British Journal of Psychology, this is what they say. Psychology, known among us as mental philosophy, has now achieved the position of a positive science. Ideas, in the philosophical sense, do not fall within its scope. Its inquiries are restricted entirely to facts. But dear old John Belloff in 1973, and it's worth thinking about this quote, psychology has yet to establish a single fact about human behavior. Not one. Next slide. The roots of modernist psychology can be understood as racism, heterosexism, and colonialism. These form the foundations of what kind of differences might be explored, what kind of treatments might be suggested for those seen as sufficiently beyond the arbitrary norms declared by a non-reflexive hegemony within the psi professions. Allied with notions of degeneration, the differences promoted by psi have led to othering, sterilization, and death making. And for those of you who don't know of death making, it's a term that Wolfensberger coined to describe the destruction of the body or the spirit in human services. Next slide. The British Psychological Society was formed in 1904. To give you an idea of their appreciation of facts, in the year 2000, they claimed it was their centenary because it fitted in with the millennium. But the BPS was actually formed in 1904. Within the BPS, well, slightly beyond the BPS, but there were members of the BPS who were members of the Eugenics Society. They included Spearman and Pearson. Then, of course, you had the Burt Survey in 1915, and Cyril Burt's survey was basically done to there were financial shortages in educational facilities, and he did a survey to show those children who were uneducable. Next slide. This is Terman. Dullness seems to be racial. Psychologists and their IQ tests are the beacon light of the eugenics movement. This is Brigham, and Brigham's job was to, he was selecting people for the American military, and his job was to sort out people of an officer class and people of who would just be ordinary troops, and of course, to separate out Black African Americans on the basis that they couldn't be in mixed troops anyway. And this is what Brigham said, another psychologist. Our data indicate clearly the intellectual superiority of the Nordic race group, whoever they are. Next slide. This is Cattell, inventor of the 16PF, the good old 16 personality factors. I've got 107 personality factors. He's only got 16. The vast majority of humans on the planet are obsolete, and the earth will be choked with the more primitive forerunners unless a way is found to eliminate them. Clarity of discussion would be greatly aided if genocide were reserved for a literal killing off of all living members of a people, and genthanasia for what has been above called phasing out, in which a moribund culture is ended by educational and birth control measures. He founded a thing called Beyondism, and Beyondism in its way was pure Nazism. Next slide, please. Okay, I'm going to go back to some of the more systematic, well, destruction, but the more systematic anti-Semitism within in life generally, I suppose, but also particularly within Psi. So we have two kind of contrasting positions. One position is how Behoven, psychology and psychiatry and psychoanalysis particularly, but psychotherapy, how behoven they are to the Jewish tradition, the Jewish principles. Goodness knows how many Jewish founders. But on the other side of the coin, you have the way psychiatry and psychology have been involved in awesome destructiveness. A discourse in the 1860s on a Jewish propensity to mental illness, a trope used in later years by those fearing degeneration in the Aryan and Anglo-Saxon gene pool, led to Charcot's treatment of Jewish nervousness of the Salpêtrière by the 1890s. Next slide. In early 19th century Germany, being Jewish was, by definition, a kind of criminality and immorality. Being Jewish was understood as a separate category with its own presumed hereditary and racial characteristics, principal amongst which was the notion of the judicial Goner, or Jewish crook. My parents used to think of me as a Jewish crook, so it's a bit mean. Jewish patients at the Eberbach Asylum avoided the medicalization of conduct considered objectionable to the self or others. Jews were denied civic rights. Any antisocial behavior and associated criminality was seen as an element of a judicial Gauner character rather than mental illness. So we're just naturally unpleasant thieves. Next slide. In 1899, industrialist and social Darwinist Friedrich Krupp funds the Jena Prize for a scientific answer to the question, what can we learn from the principles of evolution for the development of laws and states? Closing date, 1st of December, 1902. Next slide. The winning entrant, Schellmayer, used Weissmann's theories of selectionist biology to formulate a code of generative ethics. The unfit would be prevented from reproducing. The degenerative included the insane, the feeble-minded, the alcoholic, those infected by TB and VD, and criminals. That's a quote from one of my books, as you can see at the bottom. That's a critical A to Z of electroshock. And a critical A to Z of electroshock is not just about electroshock. Next slide. In 1929, in Nuremberg, Hitler made declarations against the weak, whose lives were burdensome for the state. While euthanasia of the supposedly incurable was supported and legitimized by Hitler, medical experts took a crucial role in its administration. Victims were primarily children of under 3 years of age, diagnosed as mentally retarded or congenitally malformed, and the mentally ill. That's from Bob Lifton again, the Nazi doctors. Next line. Philip Buhler, Victor Brack, Hitler's physician, and the pediatricians Wentzler and Cattell initiated killing under the auspices of the Reich Committee for the Scientific Registration of Serious Hereditary and Congenital Illnesses. In October 1939, Hitler enabled Buhler and Brandt to begin Gnadtod, mercy killing of patients judged incurable by a psychiatric team. And just to bring this, I'm going to go back to the past in a moment, but just to bring this right up to date, around about, when would it be? 15 years ago, I was invited to Australia to do a talk, and I went down to do a talk, and Jeff Masson happened to be there. And Jeff Masson was, he was actually talking on Robert Lifton, but anyway, he was down there, and he told me about a case in Holland at the time, where a child branded with ADHD aged 7, was being put forward by his parents for euthanasia on the grounds that ADHD wasn't curable. So in Holland, mercy killing of people who've been branded in some way, and you can be branded by psychologists, by psychiatrists, by counselors, by anybody really. You can brand yourself if you want. But in Holland, even now, there are children who have been described as incurable because they might be depressed, they might have a diagnosis of ADHD, and they're being put forward for euthanasia. And that's, 80 years after Hitler enabled Genatentod. Next slide. This gets a bit hard now. I'm sorry. Anyway, Jewish and Polish parents from Mesritz-Alperwalde were killed by a strong sedative from December 39. In June 1940, gas chambers were built in German hospitals, and the gassing of Jewish patients began. In 1941, Eugen Fischer, who lived for over 20 years after the war, co-director of the Kaiser Wilhelm Institute for Archaeology, declared Bolsheviks and Jews to be a distinct degenerative species. And once you're a distinct species, you can be killed by anybody. Next slide. Here are some examples of current anti-Semitism. And I think the annihilation of Jews during the Second World War was a bit beyond anti-Semitism, but here are some examples of anti-Semitism. Kate Lowenthal actually put this slide up during one of her talks on invisible anti-Semitism. So this is published in an article by the president of the National Union of Students, Megan Dunn. There was a poster saying Hitler was right. People were tweeting, Jewish people should be popped back in the oven. Remember, these are psychology students. There were graphics which called Jews Zionist, racist scum. And of course, you know, the Holocaust was invented, didn't happen, just didn't happen. None of my relatives were killed in the Holocaust. It was all just a lie. The people who write blogs that 9/11 was an insurance scam, but that was a secret Jewish network. There are those that write on Facebook that Adolf and co should have finished the job. Pose questions like, why stop at 6 million? And of course, there are artists who depict Jews as thieves with big noses. I once talked to my mum about my nose. I'd spent a long time being bullied and beaten up as a kid. And I talked to my mum about my nose, and I said, you know, I can't bear this. I'm just so obvious, and I'm ugly. And my dear mother, who of course adored me, a good Jewish girl, my dear mother said, I think I was 18 at the time. My mother said, Craig, how many girlfriends have you had? And I said, oh, I don't know, 15. And she says, are they all stupid? So maybe my nose is okay. It's funny what you can do with a big nose. Okay, next slide. This is an example, I think, of this wasn't Kate's example, but this is an example from me of what might be regarded as invisible anti-Semitism. The British Psychological Society runs a thing called the Division of Clinical Psychology. And for years and years and years, well, from the outset, they respect Christian festivals, so they don't meet at Christmas, but they have no problem at all arranging committee meetings at Rosh Hashanah or Yom Kippur. Now, of course, if I was Orthodox, I could probably celebrate a holiday for about 320 days a year. But at the very least, you'd think that Rosh Hashanah and Yom Kippur might be expected. The other difficulty for the different varieties of Orthodox Jew is there's a considerable problem with attendance at lectures on a Friday that run over sundown, because if you're Orthodox, you're obviously not meant to use electricity after sundown. And increasingly, universities, you log in and you log out using an electronic tag. So for observant Jews, attendance on a Friday is difficult. They can attend, but they have to leave early. And if they leave early, they lose points. The other thing is worth saying about the DCP, the Division of Clinical Psychology problem, was that for a long time, one of the chairs was a woman called Leslie Cohen, who was married to an observant Jew. And she spent probably 3 years trying to change the timetable to respect Rosh Hashanah or Yom Kippur, and nothing changed. Next slide, please. Now, Jew Watch takes these things to extremes and takes these things back to some of the original founders of psychology and psychotherapy. So it promotes Holocaust denial, and there are allegations that there's a Jewish conspiracy, and of course they control the media and banking. Believe me, if my family controlled the media and banking, I would be extremely wealthy. There are also accusations of Jewish involvement in terrorist groups. Now, there may well be a bit of truth in that. One person's freedom fighter is another person's terrorist. Okay, next slide. This is from Jew Watch. This shows a lack of imagination that beggars belief. So Karl Marx, he was a Jewish parasite, liar, ideology warrior, posing as an economist. Einstein, he was a Jewish parasite, liar, possible pedophile, ideology warrior, posing as a physicist. Freud, Jewish parasite, liar, ideology warrior, posing as a psychologist. David Veschler, inventor of the vase. Jewish parasite, liar, ideology warrior, posing as a psychologist. Now, Skinner would have loved this. Skinner was an absolute atheist. He is claimed to be a Jewish parasite psychopath, posing as a psychologist. The lunatics are running the asylum. If you ever go on this site, by the way, and I wouldn't particularly recommend it, but if you went onto it, you'll find that posing is spelled Possing all the way through. So actually all these people are posing as economists, physicists, psychologists, whatever. Next slide. Okay, this is a nice, I thought when I do stuff with my kids, I say, what was the best bit, what was the worst bit? But I always say, what was the worst bit first? So they finish with good news. So I'm going to finish with good news. This is from Hillel. When asked to recite the Torah while standing on one leg, the rabbi offered the golden rule. That which is hateful to you, do not do to your fellow. That's the whole Torah. The rest is explanation. Go and learn. Which has also been translated as love a stranger as we would ourselves. The rest is commentary. Next slide. There you go. This is just adverts for myself. So that's a couple of the books. Next slide. That's any of you who are interested in critical psychology, particularly teaching critical psychology, please have a look at that. Last slide. Oh, and this is Inscription, Diagnosis, Deception in the Mental Health Industry, which, to give you an idea of how outrageous some publishers have become, the hardback edition of this, when it came out, was £94, which is about 100 and, what is it? It's about 110 euros. It's about 112 bucks. I think you can get it in paperback for about 30, but even so. There is one more slide, last slide. Harry mentioned my novel Paris. This is my novel Tiract. And the reason it's on here is it's basically a story of the Spanish Armada, but it features a Jewish hero. I think we should all have Jewish heroes. Okay, thanks very much.
Well, thank you to the Jewish hero.
Yeah, I don't want to be one of those.
Well, thanks very much, Craig. A bit of that was rather hard to, well, most of that was quite hard to hear.
Yeah, it's quite hard to say.
Important for us to face. So, shall we open it up for a bit of discussion? Anyone want to start with any reactions to that?
Oh, who's that? Dennis Berry is waving a hand.
Yuri.
Yes, Dennis.
Yuri.
Hi. I was
Hi.
very surprised to learn about Viktor Frankl. I thought he'd been in the Sonderkommando. I think you said on your talk that he was in a railway siding for a time and hadn't been fully in Bergen, in Oswiecim.
No.
Belsen.
No, not Belsen. Oswiecim, Auschwitz.
Yeah, no, he wasn't. He was kept in a train in a railway siding, and after about 5 days, he was sent somewhere else. His mother and I think either one or both of his sisters were killed, but he was sent somewhere else. And the book wasn't based on being in a camp. It wasn't based in being in an extermination camp.
Oh, I see. So he didn't work in the Sonderkommando.
Not to my knowledge.
Okay. Well, I must have read wrongly somewhere.
Well, I'm happy to be wrong, but he did a talk sometime in the 1980s. You can find it on YouTube. You can find an account on it, and he was booed off stage by a group of people in the audience who knew about the history, and even in its way a far more horrifying history. I'm not sure how many of you are aware of the history of Asperger, but Asperger was responsible for sending God knows how many Jewish kids to their deaths.
Oh, I didn't know that.
Oh yeah.
I know that the Americans bombed his clinic and killed him and his nurse.
No, not Asperger. No, you're thinking of someone different. No, Asperger went on after.
You mean Asperger of Asperger syndrome?
Yeah.
Yeah, that's true.
Yeah, after the war, Asperger went on to run the hospital that he'd had this special.
Not Asperger himself, just his nurse. That's right. Yeah.
Yeah. Okay. Anyway, but Asperger's a great example of short memory, because Asperger didn't die until I think the 1970s. But by the time he died, he'd been given so many awards for medicine, and I think he'd even been given an award for looking after children. But there was no sort of memory of what he had done during the war and before the war.
Mm.
Craig.
Yeah.
Thank you for a difficult talk to hear, but important to know. I don't know if you saw today in The Guardian, apparently some official in the education system in Texas has made a directive that libraries in primary schools, if they have books about the Holocaust, should also have a book presenting the opposite view.
What's
an
the opposite
extraordinary-
view?
Exactly. What is the opposite view? An extraordinary, strange development. So I just read that in the Guardian today. It's we're living in strange times.
Yeah.
Scary.
Well, maybe some of my relatives are all happily living at the age of 110 in some Elysian field in Germany. I think not.
And it's important to have the horror of it all on the table in front of us, isn't it?
I don't know.
Well,
I don't know. You see, my suspicion is that no one I'm looking at the screen at the moment would ever think they might become a member of the SS. So much of what I say, well, one of the things Wittgenstein says is you can't teach people stuff they don't already know. And I think a lot of the stuff I say will, it might horrify you, but it'll confirm, I think, and underline some of your more sort of humanitarian ideals. If, however, you don't have those humanitarian ideals, you might be quite excited by the idea of becoming an SS officer. And it's one of the reasons that I object to the Holocaust Memorial Day. I think there are people who get thrilled at the thought of the Holocaust. And I think there are people who get thrilled at films of people being taken off to camps in trains and all of that. And the idea that people of good heart should have to remember this stuff. Like, the people of good heart aren't going to go out and kill the Nazis because we're of good heart. And the Nazis aren't going to go out and kill themselves. So I'm not sure how important this is. I think it's important as a sort of a historical document. I don't think it's important in terms of changing hearts and minds. Possibly for children. I don't know.
Can I ask a question, Harry?
Is that Seamus?
It is indeed.
Aha.
In commemorating or recording this, to what extent do you define the target for someone who wants to then undermine what you're trying to say? So I think what I'm asking is, often when the criticism I see from, or the commentary that I see from people who I would consider to be objectionable, and you would consider to be objectionable, they are criticizing a tidy narrative that is obviously contrived. So the more we tie the chaos of the Holocaust and the Second World War into a single narrative, and it's got to be a single narrative because we have individual perspectives, right? So we will individually create single narratives, but the more we tie that into a single narrative, the more it appears to those who want to undermine that as a contrivance, and it makes it easier to undermine. So it was a chaotic time. There were a lot of people doing some very, very bad things who were apparently good people.
Yeah.
And some of them came out of the war and became respectable people after the war.
Yep.
So it was an untidy thing. What you've presented to us, and I'm not in any way trying to undermine anything that you said. I have some very dodgy correspondents who I maintain conversations with, who will pull that to pieces for their own narratives. And I want to make it as difficult as possible. And in order to make it as difficult as possible for them, I have to acknowledge the untidiness and the humanity of the horror of it.
I think, I suppose you might argue there's only a single narrative to the Holocaust, but you know what? I'm not talking just about the Holocaust. I think the Holocaust emerges because it's such a huge thing, and I just find it difficult to talk about. But you know, there have been pogroms against us lot since the 14th century. There have been you know, my mother's family were driven over here at the end of the 19th century, and they ended up in a place called Yarmouth on the east coast of, well, it's in Norfolk, it's on the east coast of the UK. And in 1928, the one shul, the one synagogue, was burnt down. That was in England in 1928. The Holocaust might have taken on a narrative, but there are numerous narratives that lead up to it. And I think part of my narrative is about the kind of the ways in which German psychiatrists, psychologists, nurses participated out of self-interest in the earliest days of the Holocaust. So we're, you know, the Jewish people in Germany were wearing the yellow star from about 1931, 1932. You couldn't become a Jewish lawyer in Germany from about 1929.
Before 1933.
Was it 23?
No, I'm saying, was that before Hitler coming into power?
No, Hitler had come into power in 23, and
33.
Well, he came into power. He started leading the Social Democrat Party. When was that? 24.
I'm not sure.
Yeah, but anyway.
Michael, do you know? Michael?
Crucially, all sorts of things were happening. You know, not being able to, you had to wear black shoes, you couldn't have pets, all sorts of things were happening long before the earliest days of the Holocaust. And so you might see the Holocaust as a single narrative. There are all sorts of roots and threads that lead up to this, and you can go back to the 14th century to discover the earliest kind of, I'm not even sure they're the earliest, but certainly from the 14th century onwards, there were different forms of pogroms against my lot.
I mean, we're a bunch of psychologists and psychotherapists that many of us are keen on George Kelly's personal construct theory, which is a very optimistic model, and it says that we should take people seriously and be credulous towards them in our practice.
Yeah.
This framework, this whole ethic, this whole ethos of that is seriously challenged, isn't it, by the facts that you've put before us. And I think it might be quite useful to try and get our heads around how we deal with that.
Yes, I suppose I was thinking about, but I suppose the thing is, you know, because I trained in PCT, I trained with Dorothy Rowe, and I suppose the thing I struggle with, one of the things I struggle with around PCT, is the idea it's somehow personal. And I think one of the things I'm saying, a bit like Sartre. Yeah, I always quote Sartre. No, I don't know what I say. Anyway, our so-called subjectivity is a form of historical objectivity, and we might think of something as a personal construct theory, But I don't believe in the person. I think we are each other. I certainly don't believe in the individual.
And that leads in a way, Michael, you sent a chapter from your book that you're writing at the moment. Can you put your mic on?
We're talking to you, Michael.
Yes.
There he is.
Yes.
Which I've begun to read about Shebet's Bernstein and Henri Tajfel's account of his work, which was fascinating in that many people were trying to explain anti-Semitism on the basis of religious, ideological differences. You know, I've always sort of tried to understand it, I suppose, in terms of Christianity being in a bit of a paradox in that Jesus was a Jew and that Jews were accused of killing him in the Barabbas incident and all that. But clearly Bernstein was beginning to get a much more contemporary perspective in saying that we're talking here about some kind of group process that Tajfel obviously went on. I wondered how much he'd been influenced by Bernstein actually, but Tajfel, who was our good colleague in Bristol University Psychology Department when we were there in the early 70s. But what's that kind of theorizing was saying is we're not talking about human characteristics or human behavior. We're not going to explain anti-Semitism by looking at the behavior or the characteristics of Jewish people, but we're going to try and get some kind of process view, which Tajfel described in his core work, didn't he? I was wondering if you could comment on that. Or
Yes. Well, I'd respond to what you said by saying both yes and no. Well, first of all, Tajfel wasn't influenced by Bernstein. He came to Bernstein's work after he had formulated his own ideas, and then was amazed at certain similarities. On the other hand, Tajfel really didn't apply his theory of group processes, which is that you develop a group identity to give you something beneficial, and as a result of developing your own group identity, you separate yourself from others. But he didn't apply it to anti-Semitism. It's a big gap there, because that would imply that the anti-Semites which he grew up amongst and which murdered most of his family were just trying to develop a good identity. And there's something which flattens the different forms of prejudice if you say that. And it's a big gap in his theory, but it's a significant gap of which he was aware, but he didn't write about directly.
But I seem to remember that he got into the whole area because of the experiences he'd had in the war. And
yes,
is that right?
He always would say, the big question, which was at the back of his psychology, is how is genocide possible?
Yeah.
But I think that as he grew more and more sophisticated in psychology, he realized that if you have an explanation of that for that, it will be too simple.
Yeah.
And he began towards the end of his life to being much more interested in history and thinking that history is complicated, but historians don't tend to fall foul of explaining too much and therefore seeming to pardon too much, which is a temptation of psychologists.
Yeah.
Could I add something? Can you hear me?
Yeah.
I just want to add something on Michael's behalf. I sent to Harry, and he may have sent it on to you, a review of your book. And for those of you who want to see an absolutely brilliant book about the roots of Judaism in something quite different, do have a look at Rock and Roll Jews. Absolutely. Well done, Michael. Fantastic book.
No, thank you for that. But that was on a subject which was, for me, a delight to write about.
You can tell.
The more serious subjects aren't a delight.
No, there's nothing more serious than rock and roll. I'm in a band.
Well, I did send your comment to Michael, and for the benefit of the others, what I thought was so interesting about that book. This is a book about the growth of rock and roll in 1950s southern states of America, where of course Elvis Presley came from. You had two communities that were basically living under an apartheid situation: the young blacks and the young white musicians. The black coming from original blues and African roots, and the white coming from sort of bluegrass and country music and Irish folk music and lots of different things. And that these two communities were completely segmented. And a good example of that was recently I was reading about the sax player in the Rolling Stones, who is Bobby Keys. I don't know if he's still alive, but I was reading his life. And he said that when he was about 15 in Lubbock, Texas, he brought a couple of his black friends who were baseball players. They were all playing baseball. He brought it back to his home, and he's being brought up by his grandmother. And she said, "You can't bring those people into the house." You know, so you had this incredible apartheid. It's the best word for it, isn't it? A situation. And what Michael did so beautifully in that book was to show how a third ethnic group, in particular the Jewish composers, we know about the Jewish composers before the war, of course, Gershwin and Kern and Rogers and all those Broadway shows, mainly written by Jews. And it was a great surprise to me to hear that Jailhouse Rock and King Creole and those records that my brother gave me. My brother gave me a 78 of King Creole. Jailhouse Rock was the best thing we'd ever heard. And they were written by Leiber and Stoller and other Jewish composers, weren't they? What I think he was saying is that somehow this allowed rock music to become a tradition in which people could both participate. I mean, Benny Goodman, who was a Jew, of course, on his clarinet playing arose out of klezmer, I think, was, I think, the first jazz musician to have black and white players in the band, which was absolutely unheard of, wasn't it? And I think I said to you in my email, I wonder if, you know, one of the things we haven't really done yet is to celebrate the enormous contribution of Jews in psychology. I sent out a website I found in which a group of 100 rated, I'm not sure how this was done, but 100 psychologists were listed as the most eminent, and 40% of those were of Jewish descent. And as I said to Craig the other day, this is just such an achievement. It's such a brilliant achievement, you know, and I wanted to begin to get my head round, was there something in Jewish tradition and in culture that enabled that? At which point Craig said, that's an anti-Semitic comment, which rather took me aback because I see myself as very pro-Semitic. And anyway, I'll throw that in for.
Well,
what it's
Harry,
worth.
it would probably be the same if you were to look at physicists or mathematicians or
Absolutely. And I'm
Wouldn't it?
particularly aware of it in philosophy because I've been studying a lot of philosophy recently, and North American philosophy is incredibly impressive, all those universities. And again, I don't know what percentage, but so many of those figures are of Jewish background. Either they were there before all the emigration from Europe around the Nazis or because of it. Incredible.
And, you know, look at our options. We either become lawyers, rabbis, or doctors. And in the end, I think we'll go the route of doctor if you're going to be a psychologist.
But it doesn't seem like a sufficient explanation. I mean, is there not something in...
It's not an explanation. I have no intention of giving an explanation.
No. But, you know, what is it? Can I ask you, who know more about your culture than I do, of course.
I think that's
what is it?
That's what I meant. That's what I meant by saying it feels anti-Semitic, because what it's doing is somehow or other, we as in my tribe are all terribly bright, terribly sophisticated, terribly intellectual, very, very good at things, particularly good with money, etc., etc., etc. And it's, you know, it's like, how do you explain the countless Jews who are not wonderful at all these things, brilliantly intellectual and so on?
But there is that's my problem. Solid phenomenon here, isn't there? And
well, there's this.
Perhaps it's because of the adversity itself.
Well, that's what I said to you the other day. I think that's part of it. I was, you know, I was bullied a lot, and I think my way out of being bullied was I happened to be quite bright, and I was pretty good at reading, and so I kind of escaped a combination of poverty and anti-Semitism by climbing up the slippery academic pole and all of that.
Yeah.
And so I was kind of driven. I didn't have drive, I was driven.
Could I add another possibility? But what we're talking about is something which happened at a very historically specific time, which was really the 20th century, and which is fading out now. But as Jews become accepted in so many different societies, there isn't the same impetus on our children, and there'll be less and less original figures in all sorts of academic disciplines. There'll be more and more women, and not necessarily Jewish women, because Jews particularly were not just being pushed by anti-Semites. So many were trying to escape from their own ghettos, which restricted thought. And suddenly there was freedom.
It's just, what time is it? It's it's 6:15 here. Yeah, well, I given I've done I'm about to enter Shabbos, so I wish you all Shabbat Shalom, and I shall hopefully we'll meet at some other point.
Yes.
Well, hope to see you in some of the future meetings that we have coming up. It's been great today. Thank you very much.
You're more than welcome. Take care. Bye-bye, everybody.
Okay, Craig.
Thank you. Bye-bye. Bye-bye.
Bye.
Well, should we give ourselves another 5 minutes or so to wind up? There's some people there that be nice to see your faces if you felt that was possible. Mikhail, are you there? Anyone else want to say anything?
Yes.
Carmen, are you there?
For some reason, Simon Schama has come into my mind. I was just wondering, what would Simon Schama be saying to us if he was listening to this conversation? He did an extraordinary history of the Jews for TV. I'm sure you've seen it, but he's a fantastic commentator.
Yeah. Would anyone else that hasn't spoken yet like to give us a bit of your reaction to this? Bernadette.
Yeah, I thought it was a great conversation. I mean, really setting one off, but posing a very serious problem for us, Craig, was by even your question, in a way, being construed as anti-Semitic, potentially. And I thought, how do we learn to speak about these things? How do we, begin to struggle with, and also recognize that in some way, the culture in which we're embedded, in which we're kind of drowning, almost dictates some of the positions that we take up as individuals. Yeah, I just thought it was a great conversation. It needs several more teasing out, I think. I was wondering, Robbie, what you think Simon Schama would be saying. What do you think? What would his? You're mute.
I don't know. He just came into my mind because I think he'd come out of left field with something.
But maybe we should have a little seminar in Dublin on this. Yeah, very good. Yeah.
Gerald, can you unmute?
Yeah, right. Here I am. Yeah.
You're a person that I think of as being an expert in positive psychology. Yes.
I have pretty good background in that. Yeah.
And
yeah.
how does one hold that positive view about humanity?
Well,
with all this absolutely unbelievable ghastly.
Yeah, right. Well, positive psychology doesn't say that everything is positive.
No.
It just carves out a part of our activities and so forth, and say, let's look at this aspect of the way people focus on the positive. So I don't see how. Yeah, it isn't really. It's not saying that everything's positive in the world.
No.
At all. But today's session for me was kind of new stuff. I mean, I knew it was how bad it was during the past 20th period, especially during the middle of during Hitler's time and so forth. But I wasn't aware of how it was. I mean, so I learned quite a bit, but I still don't understand a lot here.
I think the sort of British Psychological Society stuff, the various figures in that through the earlier 20th century, it's absolutely shocking, isn't it?
Yeah.
I mean, it's very easy for us to say it was all the Nazis and the rest of us are fine,
Yeah.
Just unbelievable.
Yeah.
There was a comment made earlier on and I think it was Craig made the comment, that he looked at the faces around here and thought that people here wouldn't imagine themselves being members of the SS.
Yeah.
And the people here who wouldn't easily join the SS wouldn't be here for very long. They would be filtered out, and the only people that they would be an example, and the people who were left would join. And I think that one of the things that's really come out of this conversation is there's a a huge question, a conversation going on in the UK at the minute about how we reimagine history today and how we judge people from the past from our perspective today, which nobody has an answer for. And the more they try and explain it, the more they tie themselves up in knots because it can't be answered easily. You can discuss it and you can write books about it. You can't explain it, and you can't provide wisdom that other people are going to listen to. I was interested to hear everything I think of is filtered through Irish politics. And there's nothing that Craig described that wasn't an abstract version of something that I've seen in more recent years. So it goes to an extreme. It's sanctioned by the state. It's sanctioned by international states. You know, we can't forget the Spanish Civil War and eugenics in general and how that fed through. It was very interesting that the birth of psychology that he described came up at the same time as eugenics. So in my mind, it's a reaction to that as much. And if there's a lot of Jewish figures coming through here, then it's interesting to note that could be described as a Jewish reaction to the subject of eugenics at the time. But I hear those conversations going on in Irish politics as well. And but we remember the Irish contribution through art rather than through science or through psychology.
Yeah.
Not sure if that provides any more wisdom. Just an observation.
Well, one observation I have is that during this half of our century that we're in now, that the whole idea of religious beliefs and ethnic groups based on that's connected with religious beliefs and so forth seems to be kind of fading away for the people. I know that this is less of an issue of who's Jewish and who isn't, and what belief. It just seems to me that in my world at least, I haven't paid much attention to this, to the different ethnic groups and different Christian religious beliefs and so forth. It's just sort of fading away and seems to me less important. But but then in a discussion like this, I see how terribly important it is in human history.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I've had a recent experience or recent knowledge in that my younger son is about to marry Navala, who was born in London but of Cameroonian parents, and they come from the English part of Cameroon. We went to see them a couple of weeks ago. There's the Anglophone, as they call it, part of Cameroon, which is a small part of the country. Most of it is French speaking. And we never hear it on the news, but there is basically a war going on between these two peoples. And it's basically genocide in that the French speaking freedom fighters, or whoever they are, terrorists or what label we put on them, will stop a car and get the door open, and they'll shoot everybody in the car, including children. And it's basically genocide, a bit like what happened in Rwanda, what was it, 10 years ago. So these things are still going on as graphically as ever. It's quite a shock.
Sorry, I gotta go. So thank you very much for organizing it, and hope to see you soon.
Okay, shall we finish off now? Any final points?
No, I just wanted to say that I thought the question always seems to be what allows us to actually be genocidal. I mean, what would send me into that place is the question I ask myself, because it's a human reaction. What is it that that, I mean, I suppose that's the question. How do
I
we
see.
enact genocide? How can we?
Well, I assume it's like a sort of escalation from small causes, as the systemic people would say, you know, that Bateson and people like that would say, that you get this escalation, like a feud, like an intertribal conflict on a grander scale. But,
And Seamus, I see, just puts in on chat, he says fear. I presume
Yes.
that, yeah. Anyway, it's been a great I mean, a disturbing conversation, but a great conversation started. So thanks, Harry.
Yeah, thanks.
I just wanted to record the chat here with screenshots. Okay, in 2 weeks' time, I think we have something along a business theme. Thanks everybody for coming. I'm very encouraged to see more people. It's a bit worried about this Friday evening business, Friday evening in Europe anyway.
Mm-hmm.
You know, lovely to see you, and hope you come in 2 weeks' time to Susan Breedy, Shanaz, Kelly, and Kelly Rawat, and who's the other person? Sorry, it's slipped my mind, but you'll find it on the website. So take care, everybody. See you again soon.
Thanks, Harry.
Thanks, Harry. Thank you. Bye-bye. Bye-bye.
Cheers.